The thing about water on the Kansas prairie that most people misunderstand is this. Water is not scarce. It is everywhere, a few dozen feet below the surface, in aquifers that stretch from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River, holding more fresh water than all the Great Lakes combined. The Ogallala Aquifer alone contains enough water to cover the entire United States to a depth of 1.5 feet. The problem is not finding water. The problem is getting it to the surface, and the problem with getting it to the surface in winter is that water freezes and pumps freeze, and the hand that works the pump handle freezes, and the pipe that carries the water freezes, and by the time you have finished the laborious process of hand pumping enough water to keep a family and their livestock alive for one day, you have lost feeling in your fingers, and the water you pumped an hour ago has already turned to ice in the trough. This is the mathematics of winter survival on the prairie. A milk cow requires 8 to 12 gallons of water per day. A horse requires 5 to 10 gallons. A family of 4 requires 3 to 4 gallons for drinking, cooking, and basic sanitation. A small homestead with 2 horses, 4 cattle, a dozen chickens, and a family of 4 needs approximately 70 gallons of water per day at minimum, and more if you want to do laundry or take a bath or do any of the other things that civilized life requires. 70 gallons pumped by hand through a handle that is cold enough to stick to bare skin from a well that may be 40 or 60 or 80 feet deep into buckets that must be carried to animals that are standing in snow up to their bellies. At 3 gallons per minute under ideal conditions, which hand pumping rarely achieves, 70 gallons requires 23 minutes of continuous pumping. In reality, accounting for the slowdown that comes with fatigue and cold and the need to stop and warm your hands before they become too numb to grip the handle, the daily water requirement takes closer to an hour of hard physical labor. Every day, 7 days a week, from November to April. And if the pump freezes, which hand pumps do when the temperature drops below 0 for extended periods, the daily water requirement becomes impossible to meet at all. In the winter of 1885 into 1886, in the Kansas settlement of Clearwater, the hand pumps began freezing on December 28th and did not thaw until February 3rd. 37 days during which no hand pump in the settlement produced water. 37 days during which families melted snow for drinking water, which works poorly because snow contains far more air than water, and a bucket of snow melts to a few inches of liquid. 37 days during which livestock went without adequate water and began to weaken and die, not from thirst exactly, but from the metabolic stress of dehydration combined with cold. By the time the pumps thawed, Clearwater had lost 43 head of cattle, 7 horses, and most of its chickens. The losses represented approximately $4,000 in livestock value, which in 1886 was the equivalent of 10 years' wages for a laborer, and the difference between survival and bankruptcy for families that had invested everything they had in their homesteads. The following winter would be worse, much worse. And Willem van der Berg, who had spent the previous summer building a wooden tower with a spinning wheel on top that everyone said was a fool's errand, would be the only person in Clearwater with flowing water from December to March. If you want to understand how a Dutch immigrant brought 300 years of water engineering to the Kansas prairie and saved an entire settlement from the disaster that frozen hand pumps create, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Willem had come to Kansas in the spring of 1882, following a cousin who had written enthusiastic letters about the free land available under the Homestead Act. He was 36 years old, married to Margaretha for 12 years, and thoroughly tired of the Netherlands. This requires some explanation. The Netherlands should have been a good place to live. It was prosperous, civilized, connected by rail and canal to the great cities of Europe, and possessed of agricultural land that was the envy of the continent. But the Netherlands was also crowded, expensive, and increasingly dominated by large landowners who had no need for the services of a small-time millwright, whose specialty was the construction and maintenance of water-pumping windmills. Willem came from a family of molenmakers, mill builders, stretching back 6 generations to the 1600s, when his ancestors had helped drain the polders that turned the bottom of the sea into some of the most productive farmland in Europe. The Vanderbergs had built windmills that pumped water out of land that was below sea level, lifting millions of gallons per day through systems of canals and dikes that kept the ocean from reclaiming what the Dutch had stolen from it. They understood water and wind the way farmers understood soil and seasons, with an intuitive grasp that came from centuries of observation and experimentation and careful refinement of techniques that worked. But the steam engine was replacing the windmill in the Netherlands. The new pumping stations ran on coal and operated regardless of whether the wind was blowing, and the wealthy landowners who could afford steam engines had no interest in maintaining the wooden towers that had served the country for 300 years. Willem had watched his trade become obsolete, had watched younger men leave for factory jobs in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, had watched the windmills he had spent his life building fall into disrepair because no one wanted to pay for their maintenance. America, his cousin wrote, had wind. America had flat treeless land where the wind blew constantly, and no steam engine had yet arrived to make windmills obsolete. America had water underground that needed to be pumped to the surface, and America had farmers who would pay for anything that reduced the labor of pumping by hand. America, his cousin wrote, needed what Willem knew how to build. The reality was more complicated than the letters had suggested. Kansas did have wind. It had more wind than anywhere Willem had ever experienced. A constant, relentless prairie wind that blew from the northwest in winter and the southwest in summer, and rarely stopped for more than a few hours at a time. Kansas did have water underground, accessible through wells that were deeper than Dutch wells, but not impossibly so. Kansas did have farmers who hated the labor of hand pumping. What Kansas did not have was any understanding of what a windmill could do. The settlers of Clearwater had seen pictures of windmills in books. They knew, vaguely, that windmills existed somewhere in Europe and were used for grinding grain. They did not know that windmills had been pumping water in the Netherlands for 3 centuries. They did not know that a properly constructed windmill could lift thousands of gallons per day without any human labor at all. They did not know that the same wind that made their lives miserable could be harnessed to make their lives immeasurably easier. What they knew was hand pumps, cast iron hand pumps, manufactured in Chicago and shipped by rail to the Kansas frontier, sold by Cyrus Blackwell at his hardware store in Clearwater for $12 each plus installation. The hand pumps worked reasonably well in summer and adequately in autumn and poorly in winter, and not at all when the temperature dropped below zero for extended periods. The settlers accepted this limitation the way they accepted all the limitations of frontier life, as simply the way things were, as a natural law that could not be changed. Willem proposed to change it. The conversation with Cyrus Blackwell happened on a Saturday afternoon in April 1885, when Willem came to the hardware store to purchase materials for the windmill he planned to build. He needed lumber, which Blackwell sold at considerable markup. He needed iron rod for the pump mechanism, which Blackwell also sold. He needed leather for gaskets and canvas for the sails and rope for the guy wires, all of which Blackwell could provide. What Willem had not anticipated was that Blackwell would refuse to sell him the materials. "You want to build what?" Blackwell said, his small dark eyes narrowing. "A windmill, for pumping water." Blackwell was silent for a moment, calculating. "I sell hand pumps," he said finally. "A windmill that pumps water would reduce the demand for hand pumps. Why would I help you destroy my business?" Willem blinked. "Destroy your business? I am trying to solve a problem. The hand pumps freeze in winter. People lose livestock. A windmill does not freeze because it pumps continuously, and moving water does not freeze as readily as standing water. A windmill lifts water to a tank, and the tank can be insulated, and the pipe from the tank to the trough can be buried below the frost line. The system works in winter when hand pumps do not." Blackwell's face had gone red. "The hand pumps work fine. They freeze sometimes, yes, but that is winter. Everything freezes in winter. You cannot fight nature." Willem had grown up in a country that existed because his ancestors had fought nature for 300 years and won. He did not understand the American acceptance of natural limitations that engineering could overcome. He did not understand why Blackwell would prefer that his customers lose livestock rather than have access to a solution that Blackwell himself could not profit from. He did not understand because he had not yet learned that profit sometimes matters more than sense. "I will purchase my materials elsewhere," Willem said. "You do that," Blackwell replied. "And when your windmill freezes solid in January and falls over in the first strong wind, do not come to me for a hand pump to replace it. Windmills do not work in winter. Windmills do not work on the prairie. Windmills are European toys that have no place in America. You will see." Willem ordered his materials from a supplier in Wichita, paying extra for the shipping, and began construction in May 1885. The tower took 2 months to build. It was 30 feet tall, constructed of oak timbers in the traditional Dutch fashion, with a rotating cap that allowed the wheel to face into the wind, regardless of which direction the wind was blowing. The wheel itself was 12 feet in diameter, with 18 wooden blades covered in canvas, designed to spin in winds as light as 5 miles per hour, and to feather automatically in winds above 30 miles per hour to prevent damage. The pump mechanism was the critical innovation. In the Netherlands, windmills pumped water using scoop wheels or Archimedean screws, devices that lifted water a few feet at a time through a series of stages. These methods would not work in Kansas, where the water was 40 or 60 feet underground and needed to be lifted in a single stage. Willem designed a reciprocating pump, a cylinder with a plunger connected to the windmill by a series of rods that translated the circular motion of the wheel into the up and down motion required for pumping. The plunger drew water up through a pipe on the upstroke and forced it out through a second pipe on the downstroke, creating a continuous flow as long as the wind was blowing. But the true innovation was in the details that prevented freezing. The pump cylinder was set below the frost line, 42 feet down in Willem's well, where the temperature never dropped below 50 degrees, regardless of what the air above was doing. The rods that connected the pump to the windmill ran through a pipe that was also below the frost line, except for the last few feet, minimizing the surface area exposed to freezing air. The water discharged into an elevated tank, which was wrapped in 6 inches of hay insulation and covered with a wooden lid that trapped the heat of the water itself. The pipe from the tank to the watering trough was buried 3 feet underground, below the frost line, and rose to the surface only at the trough itself. And the trough had a float valve that released water only when an animal pressed its nose against the valve, minimizing the time that water spent exposed to the freezing air. Every component of the system was designed with one purpose: keeping the water moving and keeping the water warm enough to remain liquid. Windmills do not freeze, Willem had told Blackwell, because moving water does not freeze as readily as standing water. This was true, but it was only part of the truth. The full truth was that Willem's windmill would not freeze, because Willem had spent 3 decades learning how to build systems that did not freeze, in a country where freezing would have meant the ocean reclaiming the land his ancestors had fought to drain. The people of Clearwater watched the construction with skepticism that ranged from mild doubt to active mockery. Cyrus Blackwell led the mockery as he had led everything in Clearwater since arriving with enough capital to open the only hardware store within 40 miles. "The Dutchman is building a toy," Blackwell announced at his store, where settlers gathered to purchase supplies and share gossip. "A European toy that will fall over in the first real wind and freeze solid in the first real cold. He has never seen a Kansas winter. He does not understand what cold means in this country. His little spinning wheel will be a pile of kindling by February." The settlers had laughed. They had laughed because Blackwell was a successful man whose opinions carried weight, and because the windmill did look strange, a wooden tower rising above the flat prairie with a wheel that spun constantly in the endless Kansas wind, producing a creaking sound that carried for half a mile. They had laughed because they could not imagine that the daily labor of hand pumping could be eliminated by something as simple as letting the wind do the work. They had laughed because laughing at the immigrant was easier than admitting that the immigrant might know something they did not. Willem finished the windmill in August 1885 and began pumping water immediately. The system worked exactly as designed. The wheel spun. The pump drew water. The tank filled. The cattle drank without Willem having to pump a single stroke by hand. He calculated the output at approximately 2,000 gallons per day in moderate wind, more in strong wind, less in light wind, and 0 only during the rare, calm periods when the Kansas wind stopped blowing entirely. 2,000 gallons per day was 28 times what his family and livestock required. The excess flowed back into the well through an overflow pipe, returning to the aquifer from which it came. Willem could have irrigated crops if he had wanted to. He could have supplied water to his neighbors if they had been willing to accept it. He could have done many things with the abundance that the windmill provided. What he did instead was wait for winter. I have learned something about people over the years, and it is this: they do not believe in solutions they have not seen work. They will believe in problems because problems are everywhere and easy to observe. They will believe in failures because failures confirm their assumption that the world is difficult and solutions are temporary. But they will not believe in solutions until the solution has solved a problem they personally witnessed, until the evidence is so overwhelming that denial becomes more difficult than acceptance. Willem understood this. He had seen it in the Netherlands, where farmers resisted new pump designs until their fields flooded, and the new pumps saved them. He would see it again in Kansas, where settlers resisted windmills until their hand pumps froze, and the windmill was the only source of water for miles. The winter of 1885 to 86 was severe, but not catastrophic. The hand pumps froze for 37 days, as I mentioned earlier, and the livestock losses were significant. Willem's windmill performed flawlessly, pumping water through the entire period without interruption, but the settlers were not yet desperate enough to admit that the Dutchman had been right. They blamed the losses on the unusual severity of the winter, on bad luck, on factors beyond anyone's control. They did not connect the losses to the hand pumps, because making that connection would require admitting that a solution had been available, and they had rejected it. Blackwell reinforced this denial. "The windmill is a toy," he continued to say. "It worked this winter, yes, but this winter was mild. Wait until a real cold snap. Wait until 40 below. Then we will see how the Dutchman's toy performs." Willem heard the mockery and said nothing. He had learned in 40 years of life that words rarely change minds. He simply maintained his windmill, kept his livestock watered, and waited for the real cold snap that Blackwell had promised. It arrived on January 9th, 1887. The temperature dropped from 15 degrees above zero at noon to 20 below zero by midnight. It continued dropping through the following day, reaching 30 below by the morning of January 10th and 40 below by the evening. It would not rise above 20 below for the next 19 days. The Great Blizzard of 1887, also called the Schoolhouse Blizzard, because it killed so many children who had been sent to school on a mild morning and were caught in the storm on their way home, was the most severe winter weather event in the recorded history of the Great Plains. The temperature dropped so fast that people who were outside when the storm hit could not find their way to shelter, even when shelter was only yards away. The wind blew at 50 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that was calculated later to exceed 100 degrees below zero. The snow fell horizontally, so thick that visibility dropped to zero and people stumbled in circles until they froze to death or stumbled by luck into a building. In Clearwater, the human casualties were limited to one farmhand who had been caught in the open, but the livestock casualties were catastrophic. The cattle that were outside when the storm hit froze standing up, their bodies not found until the snow melted in spring. The cattle that were inside the barn survived the storm itself, but began dying within days because there was no water. The hand pumps froze within hours of the temperature drop. The pump cylinders, which contained water at all times, froze solid as the cold penetrated below the shallow depth at which they had been installed. The pump handles, which were cast iron and conducted cold with brutal efficiency, became impossible to grip without gloves. And even with gloves, the pumping motion was futile because there was no water to pump, only ice that would not yield to any amount of pressure. Blackwell's pump, the model he had sold to every family in Clearwater, was designed for moderate climates where winter temperatures rarely dropped below zero for extended periods. It was not designed for Kansas. It was not designed for 40 below. It was designed to be cheap and easy to install and profitable to sell. And now it was a frozen monument to the limitations of profit-driven engineering. Willem's windmill kept spinning. The wheel turned in the howling wind, creaking on its bearings but never stopping, driving the pump rods up and down through their pipe, pulling water from 42 feet below the surface where the temperature was still 50 degrees and would remain 50 degrees regardless of what happened above. The water rose through the buried pipe, entered the insulated tank, and flowed through the underground pipe to the trough where Willem's cattle drank their fill, while their neighbors' cattle died of thirst. On the third day of the cold snap, the first neighbors arrived. The Patterson family had lost their milk cow the previous day, not to cold, but to dehydration, and their remaining cattle were showing signs of distress. Abner Patterson stood at Willem's door with his hat in his hands, pride and desperation fighting on his face. "Mr. Vanderberg," he said, "your windmill, is it still working?" Willem invited him to look for himself. They walked together to the trough, where water was flowing from the float valve as a steer pressed its nose against the mechanism. Steam rose from the water's surface, condensing in the cold air. Patterson stared at the flowing water, as if he were seeing a miracle. "How?" he said. "How is this possible?" "Physics," Willem replied. "The pump is below the frost line. The pipe is below the frost line. The tank is insulated. The water is moving. Moving water does not freeze as readily as standing water, and water that never rises above the frost line never encounters the temperatures that cause freezing. The system is designed to work in winter. Your hand pump is designed to be cheap." Patterson was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Can I bring my cattle?" Willem had been waiting 19 months to hear those words. "Yes," he said, "bring them all." The watering began that afternoon and continued for the next 16 days. Willem's windmill, designed to produce 2,000 gallons per day, produced closer to 3,000 in the constant high winds of the blizzard's aftermath. The tank filled and refilled as cattle from neighboring homesteads arrived in a steady procession, led by farmers who had sworn they would never accept help from the Dutchman with his European toy. They came because the alternative was watching their livestock die. They came because pride is a luxury that starvation does not permit. They came because Willem's windmill was the only source of liquid water within 5 miles, and water was the difference between life and death for animals that could not survive more than 3 or 4 days without it. Willem kept count. Over 16 days, his windmill watered 237 head of cattle, 43 horses, and an uncounted number of chickens and pigs and sheep that farmers brought in wagons and carts and sleds. He estimated the total water consumption at approximately 18,000 gallons, nearly half again what the windmill would normally produce, achieved because the high winds of the cold snap spun the wheel faster than usual, and the pump mechanism he had built was robust enough to handle the increased speed without failing. Not a single animal that drank from Willem's trough died of dehydration. The livestock that died, and there were many across the county, died because they could not reach the windmill because the snow was too deep or the distance too far, or the owners too proud to ask for help until it was too late. But in Clearwater itself, where the windmill stood and the water flowed, the losses were a fraction of what they would have been without it. The reckoning came in March, after the snow had begun to melt and the survivors could assess what had happened. Cyrus Blackwell attended the gathering at the Clearwater Church, though he sat in the back and said nothing, while the farmers who had mocked Willem's windmill stood one by one to acknowledge what it had done. Abner Patterson spoke first. "I said the windmill would freeze. I said it was a European toy. I said we did not need Dutch engineering on the Kansas prairie. I was wrong. My cattle are alive because of that windmill. My family is alive because I swallowed my pride and asked Willem Vanderberg for help that I did not deserve after the way I had spoken about him. Others followed. Each confession added to the weight of evidence. The windmill had worked. The hand pumps had failed. The Dutchman had been right, and the hardware store owner had been wrong, and the livestock losses that should have bankrupted half the homesteads in Clearwater had been averted because one man had built what he knew how to build and waited for winter to prove its value. Blackwell spoke last. He rose from his pew in the back of the church and walked to the front, his face pale, his hands trembling. "I have sold hand pumps to every family in this settlement," he said. "I have told you that hand pumps were adequate, that windmills were toys, that the Dutchman did not understand Kansas winters. I said those things because I sold hand pumps and I did not sell windmills, and I wanted your money more than I wanted you to have working equipment." He stopped, unable to continue for a moment. "I am a hardware merchant. I should have sold you the best hardware for your needs, not the hardware that made me the most profit. I should have listened when Mr. Vanderberg explained how his system worked instead of mocking him for threatening my business. I was greedy, and I was wrong, and some of you lost livestock because of what I told you. I do not know how to make that right, except to say that from this day forward, I will sell whatever works, even if it is not what I would prefer to sell. When the testimonies were complete, Willem walked to the front of the church. He was uncomfortable with attention, a man who preferred to let his work speak for itself, but he understood that some things needed to be said. In the Netherlands, he began, we have been building windmills for 300 years. We use them to pump water out of land that is below sea level, to keep the ocean from flooding our farms. We use them to grind grain and saw lumber and do 100 other things that require power. The wind is free. It blows whether we use it or not. A windmill simply captures what is already there and puts it to work. He looked around at the faces of the settlers who had laughed at his construction. I did not invent the windmill. I did not discover that moving water resists freezing. I did not create any of the principles that make my pump system work. I simply applied knowledge that my family has accumulated over 6 generations. Knowledge that was freely available to anyone who asked. Knowledge that I tried to share when I first arrived and was mocked for sharing. He paused. I do not blame you for laughing. I have seen people laugh at new ideas my entire life. But I hope you will remember that laughter does not make a good idea bad, and that pride does not keep livestock alive. The wind blows on this prairie every day. It blows in winter when the hand pumps freeze. It blows in summer when the hand pumps work, but the labor of pumping exhausts you. It blows for free, asking nothing in return except a wheel to push against. I can teach anyone who wants to learn how to build what I have built. The techniques are not secret. They are simply unfamiliar. Next winter, every homestead in Clearwater could have a windmill. Every family could have flowing water without labor. Every animal could drink its fill without anyone pumping by hand in the cold. The only thing standing between you and that future is the willingness to learn. Willem taught 8 families to build windmills that summer. He provided plans, supervised construction, adjusted designs for the specific conditions of each homestead. By the winter of 1887 to 88, there were 9 windmills operating in Clearwater, including his own, and by the following winter there were 17. The hand pump did not disappear. It remained useful as a backup, as a portable water source, as a simple solution for families who could not afford windmill construction. But it was no longer the primary water source for any serious homestead. The windmill had proven itself, and once something proves itself, the mockery becomes embarrassing, and the adoption becomes inevitable. Cyrus Blackwell began stocking windmill components in his hardware store by the summer of 1887. He could not build windmills himself, did not have the knowledge or the skill, but he could sell the materials and recommend Willem as a consultant for the construction. It was a humbler business model than the one he had pursued before, but it was an honest one, and the settlers trusted him more for having admitted his mistake publicly. The phrase Dutch engineering entered the vocabulary of the Kansas frontier and spread across the Great Plains. It meant building things that worked in all conditions, not just the conditions that were easy to plan for. It meant designing for winter, not just for summer. It meant trusting the knowledge of people who had solved similar problems in other places, even if those places were far away and those people spoke with accents. It was spoken with respect as if the speaker understood something about preparation that could only be learned through nearly losing everything to frozen hand pumps. Willem van der Berg lived on his Kansas homestead for another 37 years, passing in the winter of 1924 at the age of 78. Margaretha survived him by 6 years, maintaining the windmill herself until she joined him in the small cemetery on the ridge above the homestead. Their children inherited the land, and their grandchildren after them, and the windmill that Willem built in 1885 stood until 1943, when it was finally replaced by an electric pump powered by rural electrification. 58 years of continuous operation, through winters that froze every hand pump ever made, through droughts that dried up surface water for miles around, through the Great Depression when money was scarce, but the wind still blew for free. The tower is gone now, taken down when the electric pump made it unnecessary, but the well remains, still producing water from the Ogallala aquifer that Willem tapped in 1885. The well is powered by electricity now, like everything else in modern Kansas, and the people who draw from it have no idea that it was originally dug by a Dutch immigrant who understood that water does not pump itself and wind does not ask for wages. But the principle remains the same. The wind still blows across the Kansas prairie, the same wind that pushed Willem's wheel, the same wind that kept the water flowing when every hand pump failed. The wind blows for free today as it did in 1886, asking nothing except a wheel to push against. And somewhere, I hope, there is another person like Willem, watching the wind and thinking about what it could do, ready to build something that everyone will laugh at until the day it saves their lives.